Volcanic eruptions are history's most destructive accident. In a single afternoon, they can bury entire cities alive, yet paradoxically seal them in time. By the end of this journey across multiple preserved sites, you will see how layers of ash and superheated gas created perfect time capsules of ancient daily life. From a loaf of bread still sitting in a Roman oven to a Minoan fresco as vivid as the day it was painted, how did a moment of catastrophe become a window into ordinary existence? What does a carbonized scroll from 2,000 years ago reveal about lost wisdom? What would you leave behind if your world stopped in a single afternoon? The same force that wipes life from a landscape can also freeze it in place for thousands of years. That paradox hinges on a rare alignment of factors happen in just the right order. When a volcano erupts, it does not simply dump gray powder over the ground. It releases a cloud of superheated gas, rock fragments, and ash that races downhill at hundreds of miles per hour. This pyroclastic flow, as scientists call it, is so hot it can incinerate anything in its path. But here is the twist. That same heat, combined with the fine consistency of the ash, creates a seal that locks out oxygen and moisture. Oxygen and moisture are the two ingredients that rot, rust, and decay nearly everything humans leave behind. Without them, organic materials like wood, food, and cloth can survive for. The ash also settles gently in thick layers, building up like a protective blanket. Over time, rain and soil cement the ash into a hard crust that guards the buried world beneath from scavengers, weather, and the slow work of time. Yet not every eruption achieves this. The volcano must release the right kind of ash, fine enough to pack tightly. The gas must be hot enough to sterilize, but not so hot that it turns everything to cinders. The burial must happen fast, before scavengers or looters can disturb the scene, and the site must remain undisturbed for centuries, often by accident of geography or human neglect. When all these factors line up, the result is something almost magical, a snapshot of ordinary life paused mid-breath. Think of it as nature's own vacuum seal, a method of preservation far more perfect than any museum could engineer. That is why, when archaeologists dig into these ancient disaster zones, they find not just ruins but rooms with furniture still in place, meals still on the table, and tools still leaning against the wall. The catastrophe that destroyed the inhabitants also saved their belongings from oblivion. Mount Vesuvius dominates the Bay of Naples, a sleeping giant that woke in 79 CE. Its eruption reshaped the region and created two of the most famous time capsules in history. Pompeii and Herculaneum sit on opposite sides of the volcano, each buried by a different face of the same disaster. Pompeii received a heavy blanket of ash and pumice that collapsed roofs and filled streets, while Herculaneum was hit by a series of superheated pyroclastic surges that carbonized wood and sealed the town under more than 60 feet of volcanic material. That deeper covering preserved organic remains with astonishing fidelity, from wooden furniture to food still stored in pantry jars. Together, these two towns reveal the daily rhythm of a Roman world that otherwise would have vanished without a trace. But Pompeii and Herculaneum are not the only examples. Far to the east, on the volcanic island of Santorini, the Minoan eruption around 1600 BCE buried the settlement under layers of pumice and ash. Here, the preservation is equally extraordinary. Frescoes of dolphins and lilies still cover the walls, and multi-story buildings stand with their windows and staircases intact. No human remains have been found leading researchers to believe the inhabitants had time to flee before the eruption peaked. What they left behind was a perfectly preserved Bronze Age town, frozen centuries before the height of classical Greece. Then there are the lesser-known sites clustered around Vesuvius itself. A wealthy seaside villa and a resort town with sprawling gardens were also buried in the same 79 CE event. These sites offer a different perspective. They show not the crowded streets of a commercial city, but the leisure and luxury of the Roman elite, with elaborate wall paintings and colonnaded courtyards sealed beneath the ash. Together, these locations span more than 16 centuries and 2 different volcanic systems. Yet they share one thing in common. The very force that destroyed them also protected their stories from the erosion of time. Each site opens a different window into ancient life, and what we find inside those windows is far more intimate than any grand monument could ever reveal. The ash that buried Pompeii fell for 18 hours straight. It began as a gentle rain of pumice stones, small and light enough to drift down like snow, but relentless. As the hours passed, the layer thickened. Roofs groaned and collapsed under the accumulating weight. People who stayed inside their homes were trapped not by flame, but by debris piling higher than their doors. Those who fled through the streets found themselves wading through drifts that rose to their knees, then their waists. By the time the sun rose the next morning, much of Pompeii lay buried under nearly 10 feet of pumice and ash. But that was only the first act. The true preservation came later with the pyroclastic surges. These were clouds of superheated gas and fine volcanic particles that rushed down the mountain at speeds of over 100 miles per hour. They did not simply cover the landscape, they sterilized it. Temperatures inside these surges reached several hundred degrees Celsius, hot enough to boil soft tissues and cause wood to char in an instant. Yet the very intensity of that heat created a paradox. It drove out all moisture and oxygen from the organic matter, effectively mummifying it. When the surges cooled, they left behind a hard, cement-like layer of ash that could be nearly 80 feet deep in places like Herculaneum. Sealed under that immense weight, with no air and no water, the normal processes of decay simply could not happen. Bacteria need moisture to break down flesh. Wood-rotting fungi need oxygen. Metals corrode only in the presence of water or air. All of those were. What remained was a hollow void, an exact imprint of the object that had once been there. A human body, for example, would slowly decompose inside its ash cocoon, leaving behind a cavity shaped like the person who died. Centuries later, when archaeologists discovered these cavities, they realized they could fill them with plaster. When the plaster hardened and the surrounding ash was chipped away, it revealed a perfect cast of the person's final pose. Not a skeleton, but the outline of their clothing, the expression on their face, the position of their hands. These casts have given us an intimate view of the last moments of individuals who lived 2,000 years ago. The same technique works for organic objects of all kinds. Baskets, ropes, food, and even wooden furniture left negative spaces that researchers have filled with plaster or resin. In some cases, the ash preserved the shape of a loaf of bread still sitting in a baker's oven, the impression of a fruit left on a table, the curl of a sleeping dog. The volcano did not just destroy, it recorded. It pressed an impression of everyday Roman life into the earth, like a fossil made in a single afternoon. And that record, sealed for centuries, still waits to be discovered beneath the fields and vineyards that now cover those ancient towns. The buried city of Pompeii remained hidden for nearly 1,700 years. Farmers planting vineyards on the slopes below Mount Vesuvius had long noticed that their plows struck something hard beneath the soil. They dismissed it as old stone or ancient rubble. In 1599, an architect named Fontana was digging a channel to bring water to the nearby town of. His workers broke through a wall covered in frescoes and inscriptions. Fontana recognized he had stumbled upon something Roman, but he covered the tunnel back up, either out of caution or because he was simply following his orders. The site fell silent again. It was not until 1748 that the story truly began. King Charles of Bourbon, who ruled the Kingdom of Naples, ordered a systematic excavation. His motives were not archaeological in the modern sense. He wanted statues, jewelry, and valuable artworks to decorate his palace. Teams of workers dug tunnels and trenches, pulling out anything that looked precious. They often destroyed fragile remains in the process. They tossed aside carbonized bread and cloth because those items had no market value. They hacked through wall paintings to lift them off the plaster. The whole operation was a treasure hunt, and the goal was to fill royal collections with beautiful objects. Yet even in this early, rough period, something remarkable became clear. The quality of preservation was unlike anything ever seen at other Roman sites. In Rome itself, most ancient structures had been stripped of their marble, looted of their bronze, and left to crumble. At Pompeii, buildings stood with their roofs intact. Furniture made of wood had left its impression in the ash, allowing casts to be made. Paintings on walls still glowed with vivid colors. In one house, excavators found a loaf of bread still sitting in a blackened oven. In another, jars of olives and figs remained sealed with resin. The treasure hunters had no language for what they were uncovering. They saw only curiosities. But the objects themselves were speaking, even if no one was yet ready to listen. Over the decades, the approach began to change. By the early 19th century, scholars pushed for more careful methods. They wanted to document where each object was found, not just to add it to a collection. They wanted to understand the context, the way a room was arranged, the tools left on a workbench, the graffiti scratched into a wall. This shift was slow and uneven. For every careful archaeologist, there were still workers eager to dig fast and sell finds. But gradually, the idea took hold that the value of these sites lay not in individual treasures, but in the complete picture of daily life they revealed. Pompeii and Herculaneum became a kind of laboratory for understanding the Roman world. Before their rediscovery, historians had relied on grand architecture, government records, and the writings of authors like Pliny and Cicero. Those sources told them about emperors and battles and public works. They said little about how ordinary people lived. The ash-choked streets of Pompeii told a different story. They showed bakeries with mills still in place, laundries with stone basins, taverns with wine jars set into counters, and small houses with kitchens barely larger than a closet. They revealed that Romans slept on narrow beds, cooked over charcoal braziers, and lit their homes with simple oil lamps. They also showed signs of human care and creativity, like a bronze baby rattle still shaped like a bell, or a children's game board scratched into a stone step. The effect on historical understanding was profound. Scholars suddenly realized that the Roman past was not a distant, marble monument. It was a world of people who worried about the same small things people still worry about: where to store the grain for winter, how to keep a child entertained, what to cook for dinner. The objects from Pompeii and Herculaneum put flesh on the bones of history, and they did it in a way no written record ever could. Each discovery chipped away at the idea that ancient people were somehow different or less complex than modern ones. The deeper they dug, the more familiar the past became. And the more familiar it grew, the more urgent it seemed to protect what remained. A few miles down the coast, a different town slept even deeper. Herculaneum was smaller than Pompeii, but its preservation was so extraordinary that it often makes Pompeii look rough and incomplete by comparison. The reason goes back to how the eruption unfolded on that particular slope of Vesuvius. Pompeii was buried primarily by falling pumice and ash, a process that crushed roofs and filled spaces with heavy debris. Herculaneum, however, faced the full force of the pyroclastic surges. These were the same superheated clouds of gas and volcanic material that earlier sealed Pompeii, but here they arrived at the very beginning of the eruption, not as a follow-up. The first surge hit Herculaneum, while most of its residents were still huddled on the beach or in boat sheds, hoping for rescue by sea. The heat was so intense that it instantly boiled soft tissues and carbonized organic matter. Wood did not burn in a flame. Instead, it turned into a black, brittle substance that retained its shape, almost like charcoal. Furniture stayed standing in its original position. Beds, tables, stools, and cupboards were preserved as perfect three-dimensional silhouettes of their former selves. The same process worked on food. Loaves of bread, nuts, figs, and even a small jar of eggs were found still sitting in kitchens and pantries, their surfaces blackened but their forms intact. These were not impressions left in ash like at Pompeii. They were actual physical objects, transformed by intense heat into carbon that would not decay further, because it was sealed away from air and moisture by more than 60 feet of volcanic material. That depth of burial is key. Pompeii was covered by roughly 10 to 20 feet of ash and pumice. Herculaneum received 3 times that amount. The enormous weight compressed the lower layers and squeezed out any remaining pockets of oxygen. It also prevented water from seeping through. Over time, the volcanic material hardened into a tough, cement-like rock known as tuff. Anyone who wanted to reach Herculaneum in later centuries would have to dig through solid stone, not loose soil. And unlike Pompeii, which was looted repeatedly in ancient times, Herculaneum was so deeply buried that its location was completely forgotten. No one came to salvage its marbles or strip its bronze. It sat hidden and undisturbed for almost exactly the same 17 centuries that kept Pompeii secret, but with an extra layer of protection that made all the difference. That protective seal became spectacularly apparent in 1750, when workers digging a well on the site broke through to something astonishing. They had stumbled into the remains of a grand seaside villa that had once belonged to a wealthy Roman family, possibly the family of Julius Caesar's own father-in-law. This structure is now called the Villa of the Papyri, and it earned that name for a reason. Inside its rooms, excavators discovered hundreds of blackened, cylindrical objects that looked like lumps of charcoal. They were actually papyrus scrolls, the ancient equivalent of books. The heat of the pyroclastic surge had carbonized them into brittle logs. At first, no one knew what they contained or whether they could ever be read. Early attempts to unroll them were disastrous. The carbonized material crumbled at the slightest touch. But over the last 250 years, researchers have developed increasingly sophisticated methods to study these documents. The scrolls turned out to be a library of Greek philosophical works, many of which had been lost for. The most significant author represented is of an Epicurean philosopher who wrote about ethics, music, poetry, and the art of living well. Epicureanism taught that the highest goal of human life was to seek modest pleasure and tranquility, to free oneself from fear of the gods and fear of death. These ideas were considered dangerous by some in the Roman elite, but they were clearly studied and debated in the private spaces of powerful families. The Villa of the Papyri contained not just scrolls, but also an extraordinary collection of bronze and marble sculptures, reflecting the owner's deep engagement with Greek culture. The combination of a private library and a gallery of artworks suggests that this was a place of serious intellectual life, not merely a vacation getaway. The scrolls themselves remain fragile and challenging to read. In recent years, Researchers have used advanced imaging techniques like multispectral scanning and even X-ray tomography to peer inside the rolled papyrus without physically unrolling it. These methods have allowed scholars to read passages that were invisible to the naked eye for 2,000 years. The work is slow and painstaking, but the payoff is immense. Each successfully read scroll adds a voice to an ancient conversation that was thought to be lost forever. The carbonized scrolls from Herculaneum are not just archaeological curiosities. They are proof that the deeper burial and the different volcanic dynamics at this site created a preservation environment that has no parallel in the ancient world. Wood, food, cloth, and even the written word survived in forms that allow direct study, not just inference. When you stand in the ruins of Herculaneum, you are not looking at a city that was destroyed and then rebuilt by archaeologists. You are looking at a city that was frozen in its final hour and then uncovered like a fly in amber for people 2,000 years later to examine. And the most remarkable discoveries may still lie waiting in the portions of the site where the tough seal has held firm. The houses of Pompeii reveal something even more personal than scrolls, the spaces where ordinary Romans lived. One of the most remarkable examples is the House of a dwelling that belonged to two freedmen who became wealthy wine merchants. Their home was not a sprawling villa for the elite. It was a statement of success, a carefully designed space that advertised their taste and status to every visitor who walked through the door. The house follows the classic Roman layout, but with a twist. You enter through a narrow foyer that opens into a grand atrium, a tall central hall with a rectangular pool called "and that collected rainwater." Around this pool, the owners displayed marble statues and bronze furniture, signs of prosperity that would have impressed guests immediately. But the real heart of the house lies beyond the atrium, in a colonnaded garden known as a peristyle. This open courtyard, surrounded by columns and filled with fountains, statues, and flowering plants, was not just for beauty. It was the family's private outdoor living room, a place to relax, talk, and escape the noise of the street. The walls of the peristyle are covered in frescoes that imitate scenes from mythology and nature, painted with such skill that they seem to extend the garden into the house itself. One famous painting shows the myth of Daedalus, and a story about craftsmanship and desire that would have been instantly recognizable to any educated Roman. By choosing these themes, the owners showed they were culturally literate, even if they had not been born into the upper classes. The dining rooms, called triclinia, were arranged around the peristyle. These were not simple eating areas. A triclinium was a formal space where the host displayed his wealth through the quality of the furniture, the richness of the wall paintings, and the number of guests he could accommodate. The House of the has 3 distinct triclinia, each decorated with a different theme. One is covered in playful scenes of puri, or baby cupids, engaged in various trades like making perfume or selling wine. This was a clever nod to the owner's own business. Another triclinium features a series of large panels showing mythological episodes, such as the punishment of Ixion. These paintings were not just decoration. They were conversation starters, designed to inspire discussion among guests about morality, fate, and the gods. The arrangement of the rooms also reveals social hierarchy. The front of the house, near the entrance, was reserved for the master's business interactions with clients and visitors. The back of the house, around the peristyle, was for the family and close friends. Slaves had their own cramped quarters tucked away in narrow corridors and upstairs rooms, barely visible to guests. This separation of space was intentional. It reinforced the owner's authority and made clear who belonged where. Then there are the small shrines known as Larry's cults. In nearly every house, you find a niche or a small painting dedicated to the household gods, the spirits that protected the family and its property. In the house of the stands in a corner of the peristyle, just near the garden. It shows two figures, the Lares themselves, holding drinking horns and dancing, along with the genius or protective spirit of the household. These images were not just art. They were the focus of daily rituals, small offerings of wine, incense, or food that the family made each morning. For ordinary Romans, the gods were not distant beings living on Mount Olympus. They lived in the hearth and the pantry, in the same rooms where children played and parents cooked. The house of the is not unique. Dozens of other homes in Pompeii show the same careful balance of public display and private worship. What makes it special is how intact it remains. The frescoes still glow with reds, yellows, and greens that look as fresh as the day they were painted. The marble tables still stand beside the fountain. The garden, once restored with casts of the original root cavities, grows again with the same kinds of plants the owners would have known. Walking through its rooms today, you forget about the eruption. You feel instead the quiet rhythm of a family's mourning, a merchant counting his profits, a child running through the colonnade, a mother placing a pinch of incense before the painted gods. This is the true gift of the volcanic preservation. It did not just save objects. It saved the sensation of being alive in that world, of moving through spaces shaped by human hands and human habits. And that sensation deepens when you turn from the house to the objects left inside it, the furniture, the tools, the food still waiting to be eaten. But the houses were not empty. Beneath the layers of ash that blanketed Pompeii, there were spaces that held the shapes of people. When early excavators dug through the hardened debris, they sometimes broke into hollow cavities, voids that had once been filled by a human body. Over the centuries, the soft tissues had decayed completely, leaving only a skeleton at the bottom of an empty pocket. But the surrounding ash had hardened like a mold, preserving the exact contour of the person who had died there. The shape of a face, the folds of a tunic, the curve of an arm reaching out, all were perfectly impressed into the volcanic material. In 1863, the director of excavations had a simple but brilliant idea. He poured liquid plaster into one of these cavities, let it harden, and then carefully chipped away the surrounding ash. What emerged was a three-dimensional cast of the person who had occupied that space moments after the eruption struck. The technique was instantly recognized as a way to recover not just bones, but the very form of ancient individuals, their postures, their clothing, even the expressions frozen on their faces. Since then, hundreds of such casts have been created, each one a direct record of a final moment. Some victims are curled up with their arms over their heads, as if trying to shield themselves from falling debris. Others lie stretched out, perhaps overcome by the heat or the lack of air. A few are found in groups, adults crouching beside children, their arms wrapped around one another in a final embrace. One famous cast shows a large figure, thought to be a wealthy woman, sprawled on her side with her jewelry still visible in the plaster outline. Another shows a slave still wearing iron shackles, his legs bound even in death. These are not artistic reconstructions. They are the actual impressions left by real people, captured in the last seconds of their lives. Modern forensic analysis has added another layer of understanding. By studying the shape of the skeletons inside the casts, scientists can estimate age, sex, and even signs of disease or injury that these individuals carried. They can tell whether someone was well-nourished or had suffered from chronic health problems. They can see evidence of physical labor in the bones, revealing who worked with their hands and who did not. The casts have also helped researchers understand the physical experience of the eruption itself. The way victims are positioned, the absence of severe burning on some bodies, the presence of heat damage on others. All of it tells a story about which part of the city was hit by the pyroclastic surge first and how long each person survived. What makes these casts so striking is not just the scientific data they contain. It is the sense of intimacy they create. You are looking at the shape of someone who lived 2,000 years ago, someone who had a name, a family, a favorite chair, a meal waiting on the table. They were caught in a moment that no one expected, and their bodies recorded the panic and the struggle and the final stillness. Yet even in that stillness, there is a kind of dignity. The plaster preserves the outline of their life, the way a hand might have rested on a cheek, the way a mother might have held her child. It is not morbid. It is a reminder that history is made of individuals, not just dates and events. And that reminder, cast in plaster and shaped by ash, is something that no textbook could ever convey. The carbonized loaf of bread still sitting in an oven looks almost edible, if you ignore the fact that it has been baked for 2,000 years. Its round shape, divided into 8 segments by deep scores on top, is identical to the bread sold in modern Italian bakeries. That loaf was not a luxury item. It was the daily staple, the foundation of every Roman meal, and its presence in the oven tells us that the baker had prepared his batch for the morning customers who never arrived. Food is the most intimate record of daily life. It tells you what people valued, what they could afford, where their goods came from, and how they spent their hours. The volcanic ash that destroyed these towns also preserved an entire pantry of evidence, and what archaeologists have found inside those pantries is astonishing in its variety. In the bakery of the House of the Chaste Lovers, excavators uncovered 74 carbonized loaves, still stacked in a storage room. Nearby, a jar contained dried figs and dates, imported from the eastern Mediterranean. In another room, a batch of snails, still in their shells, waited to be cooked. And in the tavern a full amphora was found, the fermented fish sauce that Romans poured onto nearly every dish. Was the ketchup of the ancient world, a salty, umami-rich condiment made by layering fish intestines and herbs in brine and letting the sun do the work. It sounds unappetizing to modern ears, but it was a cornerstone of Roman cuisine, produced in factories along the coast of North Africa and Spain and shipped across the empire. The found in Pompeii was not a cheap version. It was the finest quality, made from whole fish rather than just entrails, and it would have cost as much as a good perfume. That detail alone reshapes our understanding of Pompeii's economy. This was not just a provincial town. It was a place where ordinary shopkeepers could afford luxury imports. The evidence of fruit and nuts is equally revealing. Carbonized pomegranates, almonds, walnuts, chickpeas, and lentils have been found in storage jars, their shapes preserved perfectly by the heat and lack of oxygen. In some homes, the remains of olives still sit in clay pots, packed in brine. At the Villa Regina outside Pompeii, a wine cellar contained 67 amphorae of wine, some still stoppered with cork and coated in resin. Scientists analyzed the residue inside and found traces of grape skins and herbs, confirming that Roman wine was often spiced and aged. The wine was not the only beverage. In a kind of Roman fast food counter, archaeologists found a jar containing the remains of beans, which were used to make a kind of porridge or soup. Beside it, a bronze cauldron held the remnants of a stew that included sheep or goat meat, along with grains and herbs. The menu of a Roman street eatery was more varied than you might expect. There was spiced wine, hot cheese, lentils, roasted meats, and flatbreads. Customers ate quickly, standing at the counter, much like people do today at a food truck. The supply chain behind all this food was complex. Pompeii was a port city, connected to trade routes that stretched across the Mediterranean. Grain came from Egypt, olives from Greece, wine from and spices from Arabia and India. The volcanic soil around Vesuvius was famously fertile, producing some of the best wine and olive oil in the Roman world. But even local products required transport. Bakers relied on mills powered by donkeys, and the donkeys themselves needed hay and water. The daily life of a Roman town was a network of deliveries, purchases, and preparations that looked surprisingly modern. Perhaps the most remarkable meal ever found in the ancient world was discovered in Herculaneum. In a storage room attached to a waterfront house, researchers found the remains of a complete meal, still arranged as if waiting to be served. There were roasted chicken bones, a plate of snails, a fig cake, and a jar of eggs. The meal belonged to someone who had prepared it for a family dinner and then fled when the eruption began. They never came back. The food sat there, carbonized but recognizable, for almost 2,000 years. It is not just a list of ingredients. It is a snapshot of a particular evening, a specific gathering that never happened. That is the real power of volcanic preservation. It does not give us abstract lists of what people ate. It gives us the actual meal, still on the table, still holding the shape of the plate it was served on. On the walls of these buried towns, entire worlds were painted. The same gray ash that sealed the bread in its oven also locked in the vivid reds, yellows, and blues that Romans used to decorate their homes. When excavators first brushed away the hardened debris, they found frescoes so fresh that the pigments still clung to the plaster. These were not museum pieces created for display. They were the personal choices of individual owners, choices that reveal who they wanted to be and what they wanted others to see. A wealthy merchant might commission a scene from the Iliad to show his guests that he knew Greek poetry. A freedman who had made his fortune in shipping might prefer a cheerful image of Cupids pressing grapes, a gentle reminder of the wine trade that had bought him his freedom. The subject matter varied wildly. Some rooms were covered in delicate garden scenes, full of birds, fountains, and flowering shrubs, as if the painter had opened the wall to let the outdoors inside. Others featured dramatic myths, like the fall of Icarus or the punishment of, themes that invited dinner guests to discuss fate and justice over their meal. Even the ceilings were not left bare. In the best homes, panels of painted gods and geometric patterns stretched above the diners, making them feel as though they were reclining in a pavilion beneath the stars. The skill of the painters ranged from rough and hurried to extraordinarily refined. Some frescoes in small back rooms were little more than quick sketches of animals or boats, perhaps done by the owner or a gifted apprentice. These simpler works, sometimes called genre scenes, show everyday Roman life in a way that grand mythological paintings cannot. A painting of a baker weighing bread, a painter at his easel, or a couple arguing in the street. Those were the images that connected the villa to the real world outside its walls. They remind us that Roman art was not always about gods and heroes. It was also about the pride of a tradesman, the affection of a family, and the humor of a tavern joke. The floors offered another canvas. Mosaics made of tiny colored stones, known as tesserae, covered the most important rooms and the edges of garden pools. The most famous of all, the Alexander mosaic from the House of the Faun, depicts the battle between Alexander the Great and the Persian king. It contains over 1.5 million individual stones, each carefully placed to create shadows, reflections, and expressions. That floor alone would have cost as much as a small house. But most mosaics were more modest. They showed sea creatures, geometric stars, or hunting dogs chasing deer. In the house of the tragic poet, A black and white mosaic at the entrance warned visitors with the image of a chained dog and the words cave, which means beware of the dog. It was a practical message, but also a clever piece of decoration that announced the owner had a sense of humor and a respect for tradition. Water features, like the marble fountains in the peristyle gardens, often had mosaics inside their basins, depicting fish and water plants that seemed to swim when the water rippled over the stones. These details turned an ordinary fountain into a living picture, and they tell us that Romans valued sensory delight in the spaces they inhabited every day. Then there is the graffiti. Unlike the frescoes and mosaics, which were commissioned and paid for, graffiti was raw and uninvited. It was scratched into plaster walls with a stylus or a piece of stone, and it survives because the ash protected those surfaces from weather and wear. The graffiti of Pompeii is a treasure of ordinary voices. Merchants marked the prices of their goods and advertised upcoming sales. Lovers carved declarations of affection, some sweet, others crude. One famous example reads, "I love the one who loves me." Another complains, "The man I am sleeping with is a beast." Political slogans urged citizens to vote for a particular candidate for town council. Children practiced their alphabets in crooked letters. A gladiator fan left a tally of his hero's victories. One long graffito preserves a poem about a person who lost a ring and begged the finder to return it. All of these messages were meant to be temporary, fleeting remarks for anyone passing by. Yet because of the eruption, they became permanent. This combination of commissioned art and casual scribbling gives us a rich picture of literacy and education in a Roman town. Not everyone could read and write fluently, but many could. The graffiti suggests that basic literacy was common among artisans, shopkeepers, and even slaves. The ability to scratch a name or a simple phrase was not limited to the elite. And the range of cultural references in both the frescoes and the graffiti shows how deeply Greek influence had penetrated Roman daily life. Many of the myths painted on the walls were Greek in origin. Some graffiti quotes lines from Homer or the Greek comic playwright Menander. Even the language of love often borrowed Greek words or phrases. Roman culture did not exist in isolation. It was a melting pot, and Pompeii was one of the places where that mixture was most visible. What makes this artistic record so moving is not just its beauty. It is the sense of individual personality it preserves. In one house, an owner chose a painting of a crowded market scene, perhaps because he had started his career as a street vendor and was proud of how far he had come. In another, a woman living in a small apartment scratched a tiny portrait of her own face into the wall, a simple act of vanity or self-expression. These are not the grand statements of emperors. They are the choices and markings of people whose names we will never know. And yet, thanks to the ash that sealed them, we can see what they saw every day, the colors on their walls, the jokes on their doorways, the gods watching over their dinner tables. That is a kind of intimacy that no history book can provide. Religion in Pompeii was not a private matter confined to household shrines. It was a public spectacle that filled the calendar and gave the community its identity. At the southern end of the forum stood the Temple of Venus, the city's patron goddess. Venus was not just the goddess of love in this context. She was Venus, a protective force linked to the natural world and the fertility of the volcanic soil that made the region so prosperous. The temple was massive, raised on a high podium so that it dominated the entire square. Every major festival, every official sacrifice, every public prayer for the city's safety began here. The priests who served Venus were not obscure religious figures. They were drawn from the local elite, men who could fund lavish ceremonies and gain political influence by doing so. When you walked past that temple on market day, you could smell the incense and hear the chanting. Religion was woven into the fabric of everyday commerce and conversation. The Forum itself was the beating heart of Pompeii. It was a long, open rectangle surrounded by colonnades that offered shade from the fierce Campanian sun. On any given morning, the space would have been crowded with people conducting business, catching up on gossip, and listening to announcements. The buildings around the Forum were not just monuments. They were the working infrastructure of a self-governing town. On the eastern side stood a covered market where butchers sold meat and fishmongers displayed their catch on marble slabs. Next to it, the Public Weights and Measures Office ensured that merchants were not cheating their customers. A set of standard weights, cast in bronze and set into a stone counter, allowed anyone to test their purchases. This was transparency enforced by law, and it tells us how seriously took fair dealing. The Forum was also where elections happened. During campaign season, the walls around the square were covered in painted slogans urging voters to support one candidate or another. These were not vague appeals. They named specific individuals, praised their honesty, and sometimes attacked their opponents. The political culture was lively and competitive. At the southeastern corner of the Forum, the basilica rose above the surrounding buildings. This was the Hall of Justice, a large covered space where magistrates heard legal cases and settled disputes. The basilica was designed to impress. Its interior was divided into 3 aisles by rows of columns, with a raised tribunal at the far end where the judge sat. Ordinary citizens, some of them probably appearing in court for the first time, could watch the proceedings from the central nave. The building itself taught them about the authority of the law. The tall windows let in daylight, the marble floors reflected the footsteps of officials, and the painted walls reminded everyone that justice was a sacred duty. In a town where written contracts were common and property disputes were frequent, the basilica was not a distant institution. It was a place where your neighbor might argue over a boundary wall or your cousin might defend a debt. The rule of law was not an abstraction. It was practiced every day in that hall. For entertainment, the citizens of Pompeii had 2 remarkable venues. The large theater, built into the natural slope of a hill, could seat roughly 5,000 people. It was modeled on Greek theaters, with a semicircular orchestra and a raised stage behind it. The performances here were not just plays. They were religious festivals, musical competitions, and readings of poetry, all tied to the cults of the gods. Tickets were free or heavily subsidized by wealthy patrons. Going to the theater was a way to show you were cultured and engaged with the broader Greek and Roman world. The audience could watch tragedies about the fall of Troy or comedies about clever slaves outwitting their masters. The actors wore masks, and the acoustics were so finely tuned that even someone sitting in the highest row could hear every word. The amphitheater, on the eastern edge of the city, was a different kind of space entirely. It was one of the earliest stone amphitheaters in the Roman world, built around 70 BCE, long before the Colosseum existed. It could hold nearly the entire population of Pompeii, about 20,000 people, and it was the place where the community came together for spectacles that combined athletic competition, theatrical hunting displays, and public games. The events were organized by local magistrates who spent enormous sums to win popularity. The amphitheater was also a site of social mixing. The wealthy sat in the lower tiers, close to the action, while the poor crowded the upper rows, but everyone was in the same building, shouting and laughing and groaning together. In 59 CE, a riot broke out during a gladiatorial contest between and spectators from a neighboring town. The violence was so severe that the Roman Senate banned large public games in Pompeii for 10 years as punishment. That single incident, recorded by the historian Tacitus, shows how deeply these events mattered. They were not casual entertainment. They were expressions of civic pride and rivalry. These public spaces, the temples, the forum, the basilica, the theater, and the amphitheater, did not just exist as buildings. They created the rhythm of the year. The calendar was packed with festivals. There was the Feast of Venus, the Games of Apollo, the celebration of the Augustan Peace, and countless local holidays tied to the harvest or the founding of the city. Each festival meant a procession through the streets, a sacrifice at a temple, a performance in the theater, or a spectacle in the amphitheater. The whole town participated. Shopkeepers closed their doors, slaves were given time off, and families dressed in their best clothes. These shared experiences bound the community together and gave everyone a sense of belonging to something larger than their own household. In the silence of the excavated forum today, it is hard to conjure that noise and color and smell, but the stones themselves hold the memory, the worn thresholds of the basilica, worn smooth by countless feet. The grooves in the amphitheater wall where the awning poles were inserted to shade the crowd. The hollows in the temple steps where offerings were placed. These details are not just archaeological curiosities. They are the fingerprints of a society that organized itself around shared rituals and public trust. The next time you see the ruins of Pompeii in a photograph, remember that the empty square was once a living room for 20,000 people, and that the calendar of their lives was written not in diaries, but in the rhythm of festivals that came around like clockwork year after year. The same streets that hosted processions and festivals were also the arteries of a commercial network that stretched across the entire Mediterranean. In the shadow of the temples, merchants unloaded amphorae from Spain, North Africa, and the Greek islands. The air in the forum carried not just incense but the smell of fish sauce, spices, and fresh bread. Pompeii was not a sleepy provincial town. It was a bustling hub where goods, people, and money moved with a rhythm that would feel familiar to anyone who has ever walked through a busy market today. The bakeries alone tell a powerful story. Dozens of them have been found, each equipped with a massive lava stone mill shaped like an hourglass. A donkey or a slave would push a wooden beam attached to the upper stone, grinding grain into flour as the mill turned. The baker then mixed the flour with water and a starter from the previous batch, shaped the dough into round loaves, and baked them in a domed oven fired by wood or charcoal. The process was hot, exhausting, and constant. By dawn, the first loaves were ready for sale, stacked on counters that opened directly onto the street. In the bakery of the House of the Chaste Lovers, 74 carbonized loaves were still sitting in a storage room, waiting for customers who never arrived. That single find shows the scale of production. A bakery like that could feed hundreds of people every day. The fulleries, where cloth was cleaned and finished, were equally industrious. Workers stomped on fabric in vats of water and urine, the ammonia from the urine helping to remove grease and dirt. It was not a pleasant job, but it was essential. The finished cloth was then stretched on frames to dry, dyed with imported pigments, and sold in shops along the main streets. Graffiti found in one of these fulleries records a transaction. A customer named owed a certain amount for a tunic. The debt was scratched into the wall as a reminder, a private ledger made public. This kind of record is everywhere in Pompeii. Merchants scratched lists of goods sold, prices paid, and debts owed onto the plaster of their workshops and the walls of their counters. In a fast food counter on a busy corner, the owner wrote a menu and the cost of each item: a bowl of stew for 1 as, a cup of wine for 2 asses. A child later scribbled a drawing of a dog next to the prices. These fragments of daily commerce reveal a world where nearly everyone participated in buying and selling, not just the wealthy elite. Imported goods are another measure of this commercial reach. In the storerooms of Pompeii, archaeologists have found fine pottery from North Africa, known as African red slip ware, which was the standard tableware across the Roman world. They have discovered amphorae stamped with names of producers from the Greek island of Rhodes and from the coast of modern Spain and Portugal. Spices like black pepper, cinnamon, and ginger came from India and Southeast Asia, traded along routes that passed through Egypt and the Red Sea. Even a modest household in Pompeii might have a jar of pepper sitting next to the salt. The presence of these goods tells us that the town was not isolated. It was connected to a globalized economy that moved goods across vast distances, all driven by the power of the Roman navy and the stability of Roman roads. The workshops themselves show a specialization that hints at a complex division of labor. There were metalworkers, glassblowers, tanners, and painters. In one small shop, a craftsman produced bronze statuettes for household shrines, casting them in molds that he reused over and over. In another, a glassblower shaped delicate blue bottles that imitated the luxury wares of Alexandria. The variety of crafts suggests that Pompeii was not just a consumer of imports, but also a producer of goods that were traded locally and possibly exported to other towns in the region. The taverns, were the social and commercial crossroads of the neighborhood. They served wine, hot food, and sometimes offered rooms for travelers. The counters were faced with marble or painted plaster, and behind them stood large jars called, sunk into the counter and filled with wine. Customers would order a cup, drink it standing at the counter, and then move on. The wine was often cheap and mixed with water, but it was a place to meet friends, hear news, and conduct small deals. Graffiti in one tavern records a transaction. A man named C owed a debt of 100 sesterces for a shipment of wine. The tavern keeper had scratched the name and the amount into the wall, a reminder that in the world of small business, trust was personal and memory was fallible. Money lending was also common. In the house of the banker, a large set of bronze weights and a strongbox were found, along with tablets recording loans and repayments. The banker would sit at a desk in the atrium, receiving clients who came to borrow or deposit money. Interest rates could reach high levels, but the system allowed merchants to expand their businesses and farmers to buy seed before the harvest. The entire economy of the town depended on this flow of credit. And when the eruption came, it froze that flow in an instant. Debts went unpaid, goods remained on the shelves, and the careful records of transactions were sealed under ash, waiting to be read again 2,000 years later. From the grindstones of the bakeries to the pepper jars on the kitchen shelves, every object tells the same story. Pompeii was a place where people worked hard, traded far, and kept careful track of what they owed and what they owned. The volcanic ash did not just preserve buildings. It preserved the evidence of a bustling, interconnected commercial world that connected a small Campanian town to the farthest corners of the known world. Across the sea from Vesuvius, another eruption preserved an entire town, but with a haunting difference. On the volcanic island of Thera, known today as Santorini, a cataclysm around 1600 BCE buried a thriving Minoan settlement under ash layers that reached tens of meters in depth. The site is called, and when archaeologists first uncovered it in the late 19th century, they expected to find scenes similar to Pompeii, crushed bodies, desperate poses, and the tragic imprint of sudden death. Instead, they found something startling, No human remains were discovered anywhere within the buried town. Not a single skeleton, not a single void in the ash shaped like a person. This absence is one of the most intriguing puzzles in the history of volcanic archaeology. It suggests that the inhabitants of did not die in their homes or on the streets. They left, and they left in an organized manner. The eruption that destroyed their world gave them time to escape. What could have warned them? The island of Thera sits in the middle of the Aegean Sea, a volcanic caldera formed by earlier collapses. The Minoan eruption was one of the largest in human history, far more powerful than Vesuvius. It began with a series of violent explosions that sent columns of ash and pumice into the stratosphere. But before the main phase, there were likely clear signs. Earthquakes would have shaken the island for days or weeks prior. The sea would have receded as the magma chamber beneath the caldera emptied, pulling the water away from the shore. The residents of probably watched the harbor drain and felt the ground tremble, and they understood that something terrible was coming. They gathered their essential belongings, perhaps loaded small boats, and sailed away to safety. The ash that buried their town also preserved its contents: multi-story buildings, vibrant frescoes of monkeys and saffron gatherers, storage jars filled with grain, and tools left behind in workshops. But the people themselves are missing, leaving behind a ghost town that tells a story of survival rather than tragedy. That orderly evacuation raises profound questions about ancient societies. How did they coordinate such a departure? Did they have a warning system or a cultural memory of previous eruptions? The absence of bodies changes the emotional weight of the site. At Pompeii, the casts of victims evoke sorrow and intimacy. At the empty streets and silent houses feel like a waiting room, as if the residents might return at any moment. They never did. The eruption was so massive that it collapsed the center of the island, creating the crescent-shaped caldera that Santorini is famous for today. The tsunami triggered by the blast swept across the Aegean and may have contributed to the decline of the entire Minoan civilization. The town remains frozen in that moment of departure, a time capsule of a people who saw disaster coming and made the choice to leave everything behind except their lives. And that choice, preserved in the ash, offers a different kind of window into the past, one that shows not how people died, but how they survived. What the residents left behind reveals a city of remarkable sophistication. Was not a haphazard collection of huts or winding alleys. It was a planned urban center with streets laid out in organized blocks, paved with stone slabs, and lined with buildings that reached 3 or 4 stories into the sky. When you walk through the excavated ruins today, you are not navigating a narrow, irregular maze. You are moving along straight, wide avenues that were designed for foot traffic and perhaps even for wheeled carts. The blocks are rectangular and consistent, suggesting that the Minoans had a clear vision of how a city should function. They did not build outward without thought. They built upward, stacking rooms and workshops on top of one another to save space and create density. The walls were constructed from stone and mud brick, reinforced with timber beams that acted like a flexible skeleton, allowing the buildings to sway slightly during earthquakes. That engineering insight alone is impressive. It shows that the Minoans understood the seismic reality of living on a volcanic island and designed their homes to survive the shaking. But the most astonishing feature lies underground, hidden beneath the paved streets and the stone floors of the houses. Had a sophisticated drainage system that would not look out of place in a modern city. Clay pipes, carefully fitted together and sealed with lime mortar, carried away from the buildings and channeled it into a network of underground channels that ran beneath the streets. These pipes were not just for rain runoff. They connected to indoor toilets and bathrooms inside the homes themselves. That is right. In a settlement that existed more than 1,000 years before the height of the Roman Empire, residents could flush away waste by pouring a bucket of water into a clay basin connected to a pipe. The toilets were simple stone seats with a hole in the middle, placed over a channel that sloped downward to carry the waste out of the building. But the principle was exactly the same as the toilets that would later impress visitors to Rome, and had them centuries earlier. The bathrooms were separate rooms, often located on the ground floor, with waterproof plaster on the walls and floors to prevent moisture damage. Some homes even had terracotta bathtubs, shaped to fit a seated person, with a drain at the bottom that emptied into the same pipe network. The same system carried fresh water into the city through a separate set of pipes. Water was not something you had to haul from a distant well. It flowed to fountains and storage tanks located in courtyards and public spaces. The Minoans had clearly solved the basic problem of urban sanitation, a problem that many European cities would struggle with until the 19th century. Think about what that means for daily life. When you have indoor plumbing and a working sewer system, you reduce disease. You keep your streets clean. You free up time that would otherwise be spent carrying water and disposing of waste. The residents of enjoyed a standard of living that was not just advanced for its time. It was advanced by any standard. The organization of the city reinforces this impression. The blocks were not random. Residential areas were separate from industrial zones. Pottery workshops, metalworking areas, and food processing facilities were clustered in specific districts, away from the main living quarters. This separation reduced noise, smoke, and fire risk. It also suggests that the Minoans had a system of zoning, a way of thinking about urban space that prioritized the health and comfort of the community. The paved streets themselves served a purpose beyond convenience. They prevented mud from accumulating during rain, and they made it easier to move goods on carts or sledges. In some places, the paving stones still show grooves worn by the wheels of countless vehicles, a physical record of the traffic that flowed through these streets day after day. The entire layout tells a story of a society that valued order, hygiene, and communal well-being. It was not a collection of individual houses. It was a unified plan where every building connected to the same infrastructure, the same water supply, the same drainage system, and the same street network. That level of coordination requires a central authority, a government or a council that could enforce building codes and allocate resources for public works. The Minoans had that. They understood that a city was more than a place to sleep and work. It was a system, and the quality of that system determined the quality of life for everyone inside it. When the eruption came and the residents sailed away, they left behind not just their homes, but a blueprint of what a well-organized city could look like. And the ash that buried preserved that blueprint in perfect detail. The walls still hold the colors of a world that vanished more than 3,000 years ago. In a small room on the ground floor of a building known as 3, a painter covered the plaster with a scene of saffron gatherers. Women dressed in long, flowing skirts reach up to pick crocus flowers, their hands delicate against a rocky landscape. The blue of the sea, the red of the saffron stamens, the white of the women's tunics, all remain as vivid as the day they were painted. The volcanic ash that buried the town did not bleach or fade these pigments. It sealed them in darkness, protected from light and moisture, so that when archaeologists uncovered them in the late 20th century, the frescoes looked almost new. That freshness is not just a matter of luck. It is a product of the unique preservation conditions where the ash layer was thick enough to exclude oxygen, but not so hot that it charred the plaster. The result is a gallery of ancient art that rivals anything from classical Greece, and it gives us a direct, unfiltered view of Minoan life. The spring fresco, found in a room of a house known as Delta II, is perhaps the most joyful. It shows a landscape of rocky hills covered in red lilies, with swallows darting between the flowers. The lilies are painted in deep crimson, their petals curling outward, while the swallows are caught mid-flight, their wings spread wide. There is no human figure in this scene. It is pure nature, vibrant and alive. But that choice is itself a statement. The Minoans did not always need to place themselves at the center of their art. They could celebrate the world around them, the seasons, the birds, the flowers, for their own sake. The swallows, which migrate to the Aegean in spring, mark a specific time of year. The fresco may have been a kind of seasonal calendar, a reminder that the cycle of planting and harvest was governed by the return of these birds. The religious symbolism is subtle but present. Lilies were associated with the Minoan goddess of nature and fertility. By placing them in a room where a family lived, the painter brought the presence of the divine into the most ordinary space. The naval fresco, found in a building called the West House, tells a different story. It wraps around the walls of a small room, showing a flotilla of ships sailing from one coastal town to another. The ships are long and narrow, with curved prows and rows of oars. Passengers sit on deck, some wearing elaborate costumes that suggest they are important figures, perhaps priests or nobles. Dolphins leap beside the hulls, and fish swim beneath the water, which is painted in shades of blue and green. The towns on the shore are drawn with great detail. They have walls, houses with flat roofs, and people standing on the docks watching the approaching fleet. This fresco is not just a pretty picture. It is a document of Minoan maritime power. The ships are not fishing boats or small traders. They are organized, purposeful vessels, likely part of a ceremonial or diplomatic mission. The scene captures the central role of the sea in Minoan life. Trade, travel, and communication all depended on safe harbors and skilled sailors. The fresco also shows that these people were proud of their naval abilities. They did not just build ships. They celebrated them in art. The boxer fresco, from a building called the House of the Ladies, offers a glimpse into Minoan sport and costume. It shows two young boys engaged in a boxing match. They wear nothing but a pair of loincloths and a leather boxing glove on one hand. Their hair is shaved except for a long lock at the back, a style that archaeologists believe marked them as children or initiates of a particular social group. The boys are not fighting viciously. One has his arm raised in a defensive pose, the other is stepping forward with a punch. The scene is athletic but controlled, suggesting that boxing was a sport with rules and a purpose beyond violence. The costumes are especially revealing. The loincloths are decorated with patterns, and the boxing gloves are thick and padded. This is not a spontaneous brawl. It is a formal competition, likely part of a religious festival or a rite of passage. The fact that these boys were painted on a wall means that their match was considered important enough to immortalize. Across all these frescoes, a consistent pattern emerges. Minoan clothing was lightweight and colorful, designed for a warm climate and an active lifestyle. Women wore flounced skirts that left the breasts bare, a style that modern viewers sometimes misinterpret as scandalous, but was simply practical in the heat. Men wore loincloths or short kilts, and both sexes wore jewelry, bracelets, necklaces, and earrings. The colors are vivid: blues from Egyptian frit, reds from iron oxide, yellows from and whites from lime. The painters ground these minerals into powder, mixed them with a binder like egg or gum, and applied them to fresh plaster so that the pigment bonded chemically with the wall. That technique, known as fresco painting, is why the colors have lasted so long. The religious symbolism in these frescoes is not always obvious to modern eyes, but it is pervasive. The saffron gatherers are collecting a precious spice used in rituals and as a dye. The dolphins and fish in the naval fresco may represent the protection of the sea god Poseidon. The lilies in the spring fresco are linked to the goddess who ensured the fertility of the land. Every flower, every animal, every gesture carried meaning. The Minoans did not separate art from worship. Their homes, their public buildings, their storage rooms were all decorated with images that connected daily life to the divine. The ash that buried did not just preserve these paintings. It preserved a language of symbols that scholars are still learning to read. And as each new fresco is uncovered, we get a little closer to understanding how these people saw the world, what they valued, what they feared, and what they hoped for. The colors on the walls speak louder than any written text from that era, because they show us not just what people thought, but what they loved. That same ash that locked in the colors of those frescoes also sealed the fate of a population we cannot find. Decades of excavation have turned up pottery, storage jars, tools, and even a child's footprint preserved in the hardened mud. But no bodies, not one skeleton crumpled in a hallway or curled against a wall. The silence of those empty streets is the site's most powerful mystery, and it forces us to rewrite the story of what happened when the volcano erupted. The most widely accepted theory points to the days and weeks before the main blast. The Minoan eruption did not arrive without warning. It was preceded by a series of violent earthquakes that would have shaken the island repeatedly. Buildings cracked, walls swayed. The residents living on an active volcano, likely recognized the signs from cultural memory passed down through generations. They had time to gather what they could carry, load their boats, and sail away to the safety of nearby islands or the coast of Crete. The evacuation appears to have been orderly. Nothing suggests panic or chaos in the archaeological record. Doors were left open. Some valuables were taken, but many were left behind, indicating that people planned to return. They simply never got the chance. A second theory holds that many did not escape at all. It suggests that the residents fled by sea, only to be caught by the massive tsunami that followed the eruption. The collapse of the caldera displaced an enormous volume of water, sending waves that swept across the Aegean at terrifying speed. Survivors who had reached the shoreline or were bobbing in small boats may have been overwhelmed without ever setting foot on solid ground again. Their remains would have been scattered and lost to the sea, leaving no trace for archaeologists to find. This idea shifts the emotional weight of the site. It is not a place where people died in their homes. It is a place where people left everything behind in hope, and that hope may have been crushed just moments after they departed. Yet even this darker possibility carries a deeper meaning. The absence of bodies tells us something essential about human nature. When faced with disaster, this community did not freeze or fall into chaos. They organized. They made a collective decision to abandon their homes and their belongings, knowing that survival mattered more than possessions. That choice required leadership, communication, and trust. Someone had to sound the alarm. Someone had to coordinate the loading of boats. Someone had to decide who went first. The fact that no skeletal remains have been found inside the town suggests that everyone had a chance to leave, or at least that no one was left behind in the final moments. That is a testament to social cohesion, not a mark of tragedy. Walking through the excavated streets of today, you feel that absence acutely. The houses stand with their walls intact, their storage jars still in place, their grinding stones still positioned for the morning flower. The silence is not the silence of death. It is the silence of a place that was deliberately abandoned, a town that its people chose to leave in order to live. That distinction changes everything. Pompeii forces us to confront the fragility of human life. Invites us to marvel at human resilience. We are looking at a civilization that saw the end of its world coming and made a plan. They did not defeat the volcano, but they outsmarted it. They survived. And their ghost town, preserved under layers of ash, is not a monument to destruction. It is a monument to the instinct to carry on. But beyond Pompeii and Herculaneum lie other preserved landscapes, each offering a different slice of ancient existence. A short distance from the main gates of Pompeii, the modern town of sits atop a hidden treasure that remained buried for nearly 2,000 years. When excavators broke through the volcanic crust in the 1960s, they did not find a bustling commercial district or a cramped neighborhood of shops and apartments. They discovered something far more intimate, the sprawling seaside villa of a wealthy Roman family thought to be connected to the imperial household itself. This is, and the villa is its centerpiece. Named after the second wife of the Emperor Nero, this residence was not a home in the ordinary sense. It was a statement of power and taste, a retreat where the Roman elite could escape the noise and politics of the capital and surround themselves with beauty. The villa is enormous, covering an area of more than 2 acres, and its layout was designed to impress every visitor from the moment they stepped through the entrance. The atrium alone is grand enough to hold a small crowd, with a central pool that reflected the sky and a ceiling that soared high above the floor. But the true wonder lies in its gardens. Archaeologists and botanists have worked together to reconstruct the landscape that surrounded the villa, using casts of root cavities found in the ash to identify the plants that once grew there. The results are extraordinary. The gardens were not random collections of flowers. They were carefully planned, with rows of oleander, laurel, and plane trees framing walkways and fountains. Marble statues of gods and mythical creatures stood among the greenery, and the air would have been filled with the scent of roses and lavender. This was a garden designed for strolling, for conversation, for quiet contemplation of philosophy or poetry. It was a space where the owner could display not just wealth, but also refinement, a taste for the finer things in life that set them apart from ordinary citizens. The frescoes inside the villa are equally magnificent. The walls of the reception rooms are covered in paintings that imitate marble panels, elaborate architectural fantasies, and scenes from Greek mythology. In one room, the entire wall is painted, as if it were a garden scene through a series of columns, with birds perched on fountains and trees heavy with fruit. The effect is to blur the boundary between the indoor and outdoor spaces, making the house feel like an extension of the garden itself. The colors remain startlingly vivid. The deep reds and bright yellows have not faded, because the ash sealed them from the bleaching effects of sunlight for nearly 2. Walking through today, you feel as though the owner has just stepped out for a moment, leaving you alone to admire their collection. It is a glimpse into a world of immense privilege, where a single house could contain more space and beauty than an entire city block of ordinary homes. And yet, for all its luxury, the villa also reveals the human side of this elite existence. In the kitchen, carbonized remains of food were found, including a jar of preserved fruit and the bones of a roasted chicken. The servants who prepared these meals lived in cramped quarters tucked away behind the grand reception rooms, their presence invisible to guests, but essential to the functioning of the household. The villa tells 2 stories at once, one of leisure and art, and another of the labor that made that leisure possible. A few miles further along the coast, the town offers a different kind of preserved landscape. While Pompeii was a commercial hub and Herculaneum, a wealthy residential enclave, was a resort destination. Its hills overlooking the Bay of Naples offered panoramic views of the water and the distant mountains, making it the perfect location for the summer villas of the Roman elite. Several of these villas have been excavated, and they share a common feature that sets them apart from the houses of Pompeii and Herculaneum. They were designed to take full advantage of the landscape. Rooms were oriented toward the sea, with large windows and terraces that opened onto the view. The frescoes inside often depict maritime scenes, as if to echo the real world outside. One villa, the Villa San Marco, had a private bath complex with heated rooms and a swimming pool that overlooked the coast. Another, the Villa of the Sirens, took its name from mythological figures carved into the garden walls. The message of these villas is clear. The owners were not just rich, they were tasteful. They knew how to choose a location, how to frame a view, and how to create an atmosphere of cultivated relaxation, but was not entirely devoted to pleasure. The town also had a working harbor and a small commercial district, suggesting that it was a place where the business of leisure intersected with the business of daily life. Fishermen brought their catch to the market. Merchants sold wine and oil to the villa owners. Slaves maintained the gardens and cooked the meals. Even in a resort, someone has to do the work. And when the eruption struck Vesuvius in 79 CE, was caught in the same cascade of ash and pyroclastic surges that buried Pompeii. The villas were abandoned in haste. In one room, excavators found a pile of jewelry that someone had dropped while trying to flee. The resort that had hosted emperors and senators was sealed under layers of volcanic debris, its terraces and baths and painted walls waiting for more than 17 centuries to be seen again. Further inland, away from the coast and the luxury villas, lies a completely different kind of preserved site. The town sits on the slopes of Vesuvius, surrounded by vineyards and farmland. Here, the volcano did not bury a city or a grand resort. It buried a working agricultural estate, a villa, the kind of farm that supplied the food and wine that sustained the entire region. The villa of one of the most famous estates was a self-contained operation. It had living quarters for the owner and the farm manager, but the vast majority of the space was given over to production. There were wine presses and fermentation rooms, olive oil mills and storage jars, granaries for grain and pens for livestock. The estate was designed to produce a surplus that could be sold at market, and the archaeological evidence suggests it was highly successful. Dozens of amphorae for wine and oil were found in the cellars, along with tools for pruning vines and harvesting olives. The daily life of the estate was driven by the seasons. In autumn, the grapes were crushed, and the wine was left to ferment in large clay jars buried in the ground. In winter, the olives were pressed and the oil was stored in sealed containers. In spring, the fields were planted with wheat and barley. The workers were mostly slaves, housed in simple rooms near the barns and stables. Their diet was plain, consisting of bread, porridge, and whatever vegetables they could grow in a small kitchen garden. The owner, by contrast, lived in a separate wing with painted walls and a private bath. The contrast between the two worlds is stark, and it is preserved in the ash with brutal clarity. In one room of the villa excavators found the remains of a horse still tethered to its manger, a detail that speaks to the suddenness of the disaster. The animal had no time to break free. The farm was caught mid-season, with tools still lying in the fields and wine still aging in the jars. Each of these sites shows a different face of Roman life. Reveals the pursuit of beauty and leisure at its most extravagant, captures the desire for escape and relaxation in a setting of natural splendor. Presents the gritty reality of production and labor that fueled the economy. Together, they form a mosaic of existence in the shadow of Vesuvius, a portrait not just of a single town, but of an entire society, arranged along a spectrum from luxury to necessity. And the volcano, in its destructive power, preserved that entire spectrum for us to examine. At Herculaneum, the preservation reached a level that still stuns scientists today. Wooden furniture, doors, and even beds were not reduced to ash or dust. They were carbonized, transformed by intense heat into a black, brittle material that held every detail of their original shape. In one house, a wooden cabinet still stood against the wall, its doors closed as if waiting to be opened. In another, a bed frame lay in the sleeping chamber, the outline of its wooden slats still visible. The same process turned the wooden beams of the ceilings into charcoal, yet they remained in place, supporting the floors above. That carbonization happened because the pyroclastic surge was hot enough to drive out all moisture and gases from the wood, but not so hot that it burned the material completely. The result was a perfect fossil of the original object, fragile to the touch but structurally intact. Archaeologists have had to develop special techniques to handle these finds, reinforcing them with resin before lifting them from the ash. Even the smallest wooden items survived: a child's toy, a hairpin, a writing stylus. All of them were preserved in carbon. The same heat and seal that saved the wood also captured textiles. Cloth normally rots away within decades, eaten by bacteria and insects. But at Herculaneum, the heat carbonized the fibers before decay could begin, leaving behind blackened imprints of fabric. In one room, a piece of woven cloth was found still lying on a bed, the pattern of its threads visible under a microscope. In another, the impression of a woolen tunic remained pressed into the ash, showing the folds and seams of the garment. These textile traces are incredibly rare. They give us direct evidence of what Romans wore, how they wove their cloth, and what colors they preferred. Chemical analysis of the carbonized fibers has revealed traces of dyes, including the expensive Tyrian purple made from sea snails. That single detail tells us that even in a smaller town like Herculaneum, the wealthy could afford the highest quality fabrics. But the most extraordinary organic finds are not furniture or cloth. They are the scrolls from the Villa of the Papyri, discovered in the 18th century. These were not scrolls made of paper or parchment. They were papyrus, a plant-based writing material that crumbles to dust if it is too dry and rots if it is too wet. The pyroclastic surge at Herculaneum carbonized them into solid black cylinders, each looking like a burnt log. For centuries, scholars despaired of ever reading their contents. The carbonized papyrus was so brittle that any attempt to unroll it caused the text to flake away. Only a few fragments were successfully opened, and those required hours of painstaking work that often destroyed the scroll anyway. For a long time, the library seemed lost. Then came modern technology. Multispectral scanning uses cameras that capture light across a wide range of wavelengths, from ultraviolet to infrared. When this light strikes the carbonized papyrus, it reveals differences in surface texture that the human eye cannot see. The ancient ink, which was often made from carbon black and a binder, reflects light differently than the carbonized papyrus itself. By processing these images with computers, researchers can pick out the strokes of the letters, even when they are invisible to the naked eye. The results have been astonishing. Scrolls that were thought to be blank or illegible have yielded entire paragraphs of Greek philosophy. Passages from the Epicurean philosopher, who wrote about anger, music, and the art of living, have been recovered. Other scrolls contain works by the Stoic philosopher, whose writings were otherwise lost to history. The new imaging techniques do not require the scroll to be physically touched. The scroll sits in a protective holder, and the camera captures its surface from every angle. Then, software virtually flattens the image, allowing scholars to read the text as if the scroll had been unrolled. This is a revolution in the study of the ancient world. The library at Herculaneum is the only surviving library from the classical world that has been recovered in. Every scroll that is read adds a new voice to the conversation of antiquity, and the number of scrolls still unopened is vast. The villa remains largely, and there may be hundreds or even thousands of scrolls yet to be uncovered. Each one potential new book, new poem, or new philosophical treatise that has not been read for nearly 2,000 years. What lost masterpieces lie waiting inside those blackened cylinders? What ideas could reshape our understanding of ancient thought? The technology is still improving, and each year brings new readings. The carbonized wood, the textile impressions, and the scrolls all share the same story. They survived only because the volcanic ash created a seal that stopped time. And now, with modern tools, we are slowly peeling back that seal to discover what the past has been holding in its grasp. The carbonized cloth from Herculaneum still holds the weave of a tunic that someone wore on the morning of the eruption. Under a microscope, the threads show a tight 2/2 pattern, a simple but durable fabric that would have been comfortable in the Mediterranean heat. The frescoes on the walls of Pompeii and Herculaneum confirm what those threads suggest. Ordinary men wore short tunics belted at the waist, often made of undyed wool or linen, while women wore longer garments that reached the ankles, sometimes gathered at the shoulders with pins. In wealthier homes, the colors were richer. Reds came from madder root, blues from woad, and the prized Tyrian purple from crushed sea snails. A single stripe of purple on a tunic announced that the wearer was a senator or a knight, but most people dressed in earth tones, the natural colors of the materials they could afford. The frescoes also show details that cloth alone cannot reveal. Children wore smaller versions of adult clothing, but with more practical cuts, shorter tunics that allowed them to run and play. Slaves often wore the simplest possible garments, a rough loincloth or a short tunic that left their arms and legs bare for work. The images of shoemakers in their workshops, painted on the walls of shops, show the variety of footwear. Open sandals for warm weather, closed boots for colder months, and wooden clogs for the muddy streets. In one painting, a cobbler holds a finished shoe up to a customer, a scene that could happen in any market today. From clothing, the evidence moves to how people cared for their bodies. In a small room behind a shop in Pompeii, excavators found a set of surgical instruments that would not look out of place in a modern clinic. There were scalpels with iron blades, forceps for pulling teeth, probes for opening wounds, and a speculum designed to examine the ear or the eye. The bronze handles were shaped to fit the hand comfortably, and the edges of the blades were still sharp after 2,000 years. These tools belonged to a physician who practiced in the heart of the city, treating patients for everything from infected wounds to toothaches. The medicine jars found nearby held the remains of dried herbs, including chamomile and sage, which were used as antiseptics or mild sedatives. One jar contained a green paste made from copper salts, a treatment for skin infections that would have been surprisingly effective. The Roman understanding of medicine was a blend of practical experience, Greek theory, and folk remedies. They knew that wine could disinfect a wound. They used opium for pain relief, and they applied honey to prevent infection in cuts. The evidence from Pompeii shows that even ordinary households kept a small medicine cabinet. In one kitchen, a clay pot held a mixture of olive oil and crushed herbs, a salve for burns or rashes. In another, a set of glass bottles with narrow necks contained what analysts believe was a solution for eye infections, a common problem in dusty Roman streets. The surgical instruments and the medicine jars paint a picture of a society that did not simply suffer through illness or injury. They actively sought treatments, often with considerable skill. The physician who owned those scalpels likely trained in a Greek medical school, and his patients came to him with the expectation that he could help. The same attention to the body extended to hygiene. The public baths of Pompeii were not just a place to get clean, they were a daily ritual of social life. The baths, the oldest in the city, had separate sections for men and women, with a sequence of rooms that started with a warm changing area and gradually moved to a hot steam room and then a cold plunge pool. The walls were painted with scenes of athletes and sea creatures, and the floors were heated by a system of hollow bricks that channeled hot air from a furnace. The bathers would exercise, sweat, scrape off oil and dirt with a curved metal tool called a strigil, and then cool off in the. Then they would sit in the courtyard and talk business or politics. It was a routine that combined health, pleasure, and social connection. The evidence that survives from the baths is not just architectural. The strigils themselves have been found in bronze and iron, some with ornate handles that suggest they were personal possessions. Perfume bottles of blown glass, still sealed with wax, were recovered from dressing rooms. A set of dice was found near the cold pool, indicating that bathers gambled while they relaxed. And that leads to the third part of daily life, how people spent their free time. In the portico of a theater, a board game was scratched into the marble pavement. It consisted of a grid of squares, each about half an inch wide, arranged in a pattern that resembles a Roman board game known as or 12 lines. Players would roll 3 dice and move counters along the squares, trying to land on their opponent's pieces. The game was so popular that boards have been found scratched into steps, benches, and even the floors of barracks. In the house of the moralist, a fresco shows 2 men sitting at a table with a board between them, their eyes fixed on the pieces. They are not playing for money, the scene suggests, but for the pleasure of the contest. The dice themselves were made of bone or ivory, with the numbers worn smooth from endless rolls. In one tavern, a set of glass gaming counters in red, white, and blue was found still in a small leather pouch, as if the owner had put them away for the night and never returned. These small objects tell us that Romans had a rich inner life of play. They did not just work and sleep. They competed, they gambled, they laughed together over a game that tested their luck and their strategy. Even the children had their own occupations. In the house of the surgeon, a set of knucklebones was found in a child's room. Knucklebones were played like modern jacks, thrown into the air and caught on the back of the hand. The bones came from sheep or goats, and they were often decorated with paint or carvings. A wooden doll with movable arms was discovered in a tomb in Herculaneum, dressed in a tiny tunic. Its face was painted with a smile, and its hair was carved in tight curls. That doll was not a mass-produced toy. It was a unique object, made for a specific child by a skilled craftsperson. The doll tells us that Roman children were loved, and that their parents invested time and money in their happiness. The games, the dolls, the dice, and the board scratches all point to a society that knew how to pause the rhythm of labor and simply play. When you look at these fragments together, the clothing, the surgical tools, the medicine bottles, the gaming counters, you stop seeing a distant historical period. You start seeing a collection of individual mornings and afternoons, a woman putting on her tunic and fastening a brooch, a man visiting the doctor for a persistent cough, a child rolling dice on a stone step while waiting for her father to finish shopping. These are not the grand events of history. They are the small moments that make up a life. And the volcanic ash, in its accidental perfection, preserved those moments for us to discover. The next time you pick up a game of chance or put on your clothes for the day, remember that someone 2,000 years ago did the same thing. And that the ash that stopped their world also saved the echo of their ordinary routines. The same loops of cloth and the same hardened bread that paint a picture of ordinary life are now being scanned with machines that see through stone. Inside a hospital in Naples, a CT scanner designed for living patients was turned on a collection of plaster casts from Pompeii. The casts themselves had been treated as finished artifacts for over a century, their surfaces smoothed and painted to match the imagined flesh of the victims. But the scanner did something no human eye could do. It peered through the plaster to the bones within, and what it found changed the story. In several casts, the skeleton was not in the position the plaster had suggested. The body had shifted inside the ash cavity long before the plaster was poured, and the final cast had captured only the void, not the person. The CT images revealed the true posture of the individual, sometimes curled in a way that indicated a slower death from suffocation rather than instant incineration. Even more astonishing, the scanner detected the remains of food still sitting in the stomach cavity of one victim. The last meal was preserved, a simple collection of grains and vegetables that confirmed the person had eaten shortly before the eruption. That single detail gave researchers a precise timestamp for the disaster. Vesuvius erupted in the late morning or early afternoon, after the main meal of the day. The same technology is now being applied to the carbonized scrolls from Herculaneum. Instead of unrolling the fragile papyrus, scientists run the scroll through a micro-CT scanner that builds a three-dimensional model of every layer. Software then virtually flattens the rolled surface, allowing scholars to read the text without ever touching the original. In 2023, a team used this method to read passages from a scroll that had been too damaged to open for 200 years. The recovered text discussed the pleasure of music and the nature of the soul. Every new reading is a recovered conversation from a lost library. DNA analysis has added another dimension. Samples taken from the organic remains at Herculaneum, including the carbonized wood from roofs and the residues inside cooking pots, have been sequenced to identify the exact species of trees, grains, and herbs that were present. One study traced the origin of a shipment of grain to a specific region in North Africa, proving that even small towns were plugged into long-distance trade. The same techniques have been applied to human remains from Pompeii, where DNA from bones inside the casts has revealed genetic markers for diseases like tuberculosis and arthritis that would have been invisible to the naked eye. These were not just bodies. They were records of health and hardship. And then there is the digital reconstruction. Teams of archaeologists and computer scientists have used laser scanners to capture every surviving fragment of the walls, columns, and frescoes at Pompeii, Herculaneum, and the data is stitched together into a three-dimensional model that can be walked through on a screen. Color is restored based on pigment analysis. Missing sections are filled with symmetrical guesswork, and the result is a living image of the city as it stood on the day the ash fell. You can look up at the painted ceiling of a bedroom or step into the garden of a villa that has been buried for 2,000 years. The same digital models are used to test theories about how the eruption unfolded. By recreating the airflow and the heat of the pyroclastic surge, scientists can predict which areas would have been survivable and which were instantly fatal. The models show that those who fled toward the sea at Herculaneum had almost no chance, while those who stayed inside some of the deeper cellars might have lived for several more hours. Each new scan, each new DNA sequence, each new digital simulation peels back another layer of the ash that has held its secrets for. The tools of modern science are not replacing the work of archaeologists. They are extending it, giving a voice to objects that have been silent for centuries. And as these technologies improve, the buried towns of Vesuvius and Santorini will continue to yield information that their inhabitants never imagined anyone would one day retrieve. A single loaf of bread stops you in your tracks. It sits inside a blackened oven, round and scored into 8 segments, exactly like the bread you might buy from a bakery this morning. The baker shaped it with his hands, slid it onto the hot stone, and expected to sell it before noon. That loaf never reached a customer. It waited 2,000 years inside the ash, and now it sits in a glass case, and something about its ordinariness hits harder than any statue or temple. You do not need to be an archaeologist to feel it. You have eaten bread. You know the smell of a warm loaf. You know what it means to prepare food for someone you care about. That loaf is not a distant artifact. It is a hand reaching across time, holding something familiar. The same feeling creeps up when you see a child's toy still lying on a floor. In Herculaneum, a small wooden doll with movable arms was found in a room, its painted face still smiling. Someone made that doll for a specific child, sanded the wood smooth, tied the strings that let the arms move. That child probably clutched it while falling asleep, dropped it while running through the house, and left it behind when the ground began to shake. The doll is not a symbol. It is a leftover piece of a life that was interrupted mid-sentence. And when you stand in that room, you are not looking at history. You are looking at the debris of a Tuesday morning that never reached Wednesday. These intimate objects do something that grand monuments cannot. They collapse the distance between then and now. You can admire the Colosseum from a distance and feel awe at the scope of empire. But a carbonized date still sitting in a jar, or a bronze baby rattle shaped like a bell, those things make you feel the weight of individual breaths. They remind you that the people who lived in these towns had the same small habits you have. They stored food for winter. They made toys for their children. They argued with their neighbors and laughed at jokes and worried about the price of wine. When you look at a fresco of a woman picking flowers, you are not studying an art style. You are watching someone who loved the color of a petal and wanted to keep it forever. That is the core appeal of these sites. They are not about emperors or battles. They are about the texture of ordinary existence. The ash did not discriminate. It preserved a baker's oven and a senator's villa with the same indifferent precision. And in doing so, it created a kind of democracy of memory. The slave's shackles lie beside the merchant's scales. The child's game board is scratched into the same stone step where the priest once stood. Everyone who lived there, rich or poor, free or bound, left something behind that speaks directly to anyone willing to look. The psychological power of these landscapes lies in that shared humanity. You cannot walk through the streets of Pompeii without feeling that the people who fled were not so different from you. They had plans for the evening. They had leftovers in the kitchen. They had a favorite chair by the window. When you touch the plaster cast of a hand, or see the imprint of a sleeping dog curled in the ash, history stops being a story about dates and names. It becomes a mirror. And what you see reflected is not a distant civilization, but 1,000 small moments that make up a life, anywhere. The volcano took those moments away in a single afternoon, but the ash held them close, and now they wait for anyone who walks through the gate. The loaf is still in the oven. The child never came back for the doll. And the silence of those empty rooms asks a question that does not need words. What would you leave behind if your world stopped in the middle of a Tuesday morning? That loaf in the oven still sits there, but keeping it safe is a battle that never ends. The same ash that preserved these towns for 2,000 years now faces threats that no ancient volcano could have predicted. Rain seeps through the cracks in the uncovered walls, slowly dissolving the plaster that holds the frescoes in place. Wind carries gritty dust that scours the painted surfaces with each passing storm. Tourists in the millions walk the ancient streets every year, their footsteps wearing down the stone pavements and their breath raising humidity levels inside the fragile rooms. The very act of sharing these sites with the world accelerates their decay, and every conservator who works at Pompeii or Herculaneum knows that they are fighting a slow-losing war against time and weather. The Italian government, along with UNESCO and international foundations, pours millions of euros each year into emergency shoring, drainage systems, and protective roofing. In some areas, entire blocks have been closed to visitors because the walls have begun to lean dangerously. The House of the Gladiators collapsed in 2010, a stark reminder that even a well-funded site can crumble overnight. The question that hangs over every dig is whether to excavate at all. Each new uncovering exposes precious material to air, light, and human touch, accelerating its deterioration. Many archaeologists argue that it is better to leave large portions of these buried towns untouched, sealed in the same volcanic blanket that has protected them for centuries. They point to the technology advancing so rapidly that future generations will have tools we cannot yet imagine, tools that might read a scroll without unrolling it or scan a wall without touching the pigment. To excavate now, they say, is to rob the future of discoveries made possible by better methods. Others counter that the public hunger for history is real, and that the educational value of seeing these sites firsthand changes how people understand the past. They argue that a site left buried is a site forgotten, and that without the emotional connection of walking through the streets, the funding and political will to protect these places would evaporate. The tension between these two positions is not just academic. It shapes every decision about where to dig, how to stabilize, and which walls to cover or leave open. The sites are also vulnerable to the very force that created them. Vesuvius is still an active volcano, classified as one of the most dangerous in the world because of the 3 million people living on its slopes. A major eruption today would not only threaten modern cities, but could also destroy the archaeological remains that lie just beneath the soil. Scientists monitor the mountain constantly, measuring gas emissions and ground deformation, hoping to detect warning signs months or even weeks in advance. But they cannot stop an eruption, only predict it. When the next one comes, the buried towns might be buried again, this time perhaps forever. That reality gives the work of preservation a quiet urgency. Every year of protection is a gift, and every wall that stands is a fragile victory against the forces that want to pull it down. UNESCO recognized the global importance of these sites early on, listing Pompeii, Herculaneum, and as a single World Heritage Site in 1997. That designation brings international attention and funding, but it also imposes strict obligations. Site managers must balance the need for public access with the mandate to preserve the authenticity and integrity of the ruins. They cannot build modern visitor centers that clash with the ancient landscape, nor can they install heavy infrastructure that might disturb the buried layers. They have to find creative solutions, like raised walkways that let visitors see the streets without stepping on them, or climate-controlled shelters that protect the most fragile frescoes from sun and rain. The balance is never perfect, and critics argue that the sites have become theme parks, sanitized and staged for mass consumption, losing the raw authenticity that makes them so powerful. Yet without that tourism revenue, the conservation work would stop. The entrance fees pay for the very teams that shore up the walls and clean the graffiti that some visitors still scratch into the ancient plaster. It is a cycle of dependency that no one has fully resolved. The ethical heart of the challenge lies in that tension between sharing and saving. To open a site is to risk its destruction. To keep it closed is to deny the world a direct encounter with the past. The people who manage these places live with that contradiction every day. And the choices they make will determine whether the loaf in the oven and the child's doll and the painted lilies of survive for another century or crumble into dust. The ash that sealed them once gave them an extraordinary gift. Now it is up to us to decide whether we can be worthy stewards of that gift. The same ethical tension that hangs over every excavated wall and every unrolled scroll also defines what these sites mean for us today. Across the span of 2,000 years and two different volcanic systems, one truth emerges with startling clarity. No other archaeological context preserves the texture of ordinary existence with such intimacy. Other ruins offer outlines, a temple floor plan, a column base, a broken pot reassembled in a museum drawer. They let you imagine the past, but they rarely let you touch it. The ash of Vesuvius and Santorini does something different. It saves the moment itself, not just the structure but the scene. A loaf of bread still sitting in an oven because the baker expected to sell it before noon. A child's doll with movable arms left behind in the rush to escape. A gaming board scratched into a stone step where someone sat and rolled dice during a break from work. These are not fragments. They are frozen seconds from a Tuesday morning that never reached evening. The mundane and the extraordinary collapse into each other. A senator's villa with painted gardens and a slave's shackle found in the same block of ash. A fresh fish sauce imported from North Africa and a simple bowl of chickpeas cooked in a tavern kitchen. The volcano did not choose what to preserve based on value or beauty. It sealed everything with the same indifferent hand, and that indifference is what makes these sites so irreplaceable. They offer a cross-section of an entire society, not just its wealthy or its powerful, but its cooks, its merchants, its children, its animals, even the carbonized imprint of a single grape left on a table. You cannot find that completeness anywhere else in the ancient world. Not in the carefully curated ruins of Rome, not in the tomb paintings of Egypt, not in the buried palaces of Mesopotamia. Those places tell you about the people who controlled history. The volcanic landscapes tell you about the people who lived it. They reveal how a Roman mother soothed a crying infant, how a Minoan sailor tied a knot, how a Greek philosopher argued about the nature of the soul while sitting in a villa overlooking the sea. The window they open is not just wide, it is human-sized, and that is exactly why it demands protection. The same forces that created this time capsule now threaten to erase it. Rain, wind, tourists, and the slow creep of time nibble at the edges of every uncovered wall. The ash that sealed these towns for 2,000 years is being peeled away, and once it is gone, the objects inside will begin to decay faster than any conservator can stabilize them. The decision to dig or to leave buried is not just a technical question. It is a moral one. Every generation inherits these sites from the one before, and every generation must decide what to pass on. To preserve is to choose the future over the present. It is to say that the bread in the oven and the scroll in the library and the fresco of saffron gatherers are worth more than another year of ticket sales or another viral photograph. The fragility of these time capsules should humble anyone who visits them. The past does not owe us its survival. It gives us its secrets only because the volcanic ash held them close, and it will take them back the moment we stop caring. So the question is not whether we can afford to protect them. It is whether we can afford to lose them. When you leave a comment on this video, tell us which preserved landscape fascinated you the most. Was it the crowded streets of Pompeii with its bakeries and barbershops? The carbonized scrolls of Herculaneum whispering lost philosophy? Or the empty rooms of where a whole town walked away into the sea? Your answer matters because it shapes how we remember. And if you found something in this journey that changed the way you see the past, hit the like button and subscribe so we can continue exploring the time capsules that history has left waiting for us. The ash has held its silence for 2,000 years. Now it is our turn to listen.